Hello. That's very nice, but I'm not giving away cars or cash. I just want to make that clear.
And I am not Vanna White.
I don't think that announcement was necessary. We're delighted to have you all here. Thank you. I know some of you made the trip to this state to be here. We appreciate it, or to this city at least. And we appreciate that as well, and we'll see some of you a little bit later. So this is Peter's show normally, but he's going to be a nice, well-behaved guest, and I will be hosting. Remember that.
I will try.
Okay, and we'll get started in a few minutes. Yes? Okay.
You know what? Just to soften you up, I really don't know what questions he has, but just to soften you up, may I thank you right now?
If you'd like.
I think so.
Is there money involved?
No, no. Nothing that you would find interesting. But I thought I might try to make you feel a little bit indebted right from the get-go. So, Pat, thank you for doing this. Pat Sajak will tell you, he's told me so many times I think he needs a new line, that all he does is play hangman on television. Now, in the first place, that's not true. He's a very serious, well-read man. He's the vice chairman of the board of Hillsdale College. He served on the board of Claremont. I don't want to overshoot. Let's not get carried away here. And Pat has funded a cancer research center at Anne Arundel Medical Center back in Leslie Sajak's home state of Maryland. But even if it were true, even if all that Pat had ever accomplished was persuading millions of Americans to invite him into their home for these several decades now, consider this. I did a little work on this, Pat.
Oh, wow.
I really want you to feel
so much for the one host rule.
So. Here's a passage from Boswell's Life of Johnson. And the setup is that Dr. Johnson had just remarked that their friend David Garrick, the theater producer and actor, had augmented the public stock of harmless pleasure. Boswell, is not harmless pleasure very tame? Johnson, nay, sir, harmless pleasure is the highest praise. To be able to furnish pleasure that is harmless, pleasure pure and unalloyed, is as great a power as a man can possess. So, to the all-powerful Pat Sajak, my thanks.
You didn't tell me this is going to be so highfalutin. Boswell.
Beat Boswell, baby. That's all I can say.
Sure, anytime. So what would happen if a highly respected author and Hoover Institution research fellow allowed his long-running and prestigious public affairs interview program to be taken over by a TV game show host? An even bigger question is, why did our guest, Peter Robinson, allow this to happen? It will all become clear very shortly. Uncommon knowledge now. Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. Do not adjust whatever you're watching this on. I am Pat Sajak, and today we are at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library and Museum in Simi Valley, California. We want to thank the good folks here for opening their doors to us for this event. And if you haven't been here, it is a fabulous place, and you really should come. It's not only historically fascinating, but it's a moving experience as well, and I would recommend it highly. Peter Robinson is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution, where he writes about politics and business, and he, more often than not, is the host of the show. He has degrees from Dartmouth College and Oxford University. He spent 6 years at the White House, first as chief speechwriter to Vice President George Bush, and then as a special assistant and speechwriter to President Ronald Reagan. And on this, the 30th anniversary year of Reagan's famous Mr. Gorbachev Tear Down This Wall speech at Brandenburg Gate, a speech written by Mr. Robinson, we thought we'd turn the tables on Peter and talk about that historic address and the events surrounding it and leading to it and following it. And we might even dwell into a few other areas with our guest, Mr. Peter Robinson.
Thank you, Pat.
Are you nervous?
I'm extremely nervous, remarkably enough.
I will be gentle. We're going to talk a lot about the speech because that's why we're here after all. But let's talk about what got you into the position where you could write that speech. And I mention this because I want to show you a picture, folks. This is Peter with the President of the United States. And you'll notice that one of them looks more comfortable with the camera than the other. I won't say which is which. How old were you in that picture?
In that picture, I was 25.
So this is a big deal. You're going to be writing speeches for the President of the United States. How does a 25-year-old get into that position?
This is not a story that reflects well on me or on a couple of people we know or on the federal government. After college, I studied at Oxford. You mentioned I got a degree from Oxford. I stayed in Oxford an extra year to try to write a novel. At the end of the year, I had a novel so bad that I couldn't stand reading it. And William F. Buckley, Jr., the late and great conservative journalist, who much to his credit encouraged young conservatives, suggested that I try to go to Washington and become a speechwriter. It was 1982, and Bill said, get in touch with my son Christopher, who was then writing speeches for Vice President Bush. So I flew from Oxford to Washington, presented myself to Christopher Buckley, hoping he might have a lead on a job writing for a member of Congress or for the Postmaster General. And Christopher said, well, I'm about to leave this job in 2 weeks, and my replacement just fell through. I don't see any good reason you shouldn't write speeches for the Vice President of the United States. And while you're here, go downstairs in the old executive office building, and talk to Tony Dolan, who's the President's chief speechwriter. I did that. While I was talking to Tony, the phone rang. It was the gubernatorial campaign of a man called Lou Lehrman, who was running against Mario Cuomo for governor of New York. And Tony Dolan, and they needed a speechwriter. And Tony said, I have just the man. And Christopher, the next day, told the Bush people that he found the perfect replacement for himself, yours truly, but that they'd better move fast because Lou Lehrman wanted me. And Tony told Lehrman's people, found the perfect guy for you, Robinson, but move fast because the Bush people want him. And so I went back and forth from interview to interview, New York to Washington, and at the end of 2 weeks, they both offered me a job, and nobody asked if I had ever written a speech before.
Your government in action, lady.
Your government in action. And it was a very good thing that nobody asked because I had never written a speech before.
Is that true? You had actually never put words
Never
on paper that
written
someone else
a
had to say?
speech before. Wow. No, that is literally true. And so I then spent 6 years in the White House waiting at any moment to be discovered. I mean, found out is what I really mean.
So you joined the Vice President's.
Vice President's staff, I worked for George H.W. Bush for not quite a year and a half, and then joined the President's staff. The Vice President's staff was small and informal, which is how I survived. It turned out two things happened that couldn't have been predicted, but just worked. One was that George H.W. Bush and I just got along well together. I think I amused him. When his press secretary, I made it all the way through the interviews, and the press secretary took me in to introduce me to the then Vice President. And the Vice President, I was standing, and he looked at my shoes and let his gaze go up to my eyes, and then he turned to the press secretary and said, well, he looks about the right height, let's hope it works out.
This apparently was before something called vetting.
Yes. And it did work out. So he and I got along, and then it turned out speechwriting is not a high art, really. It's more of a knack. You can imitate Jack Benny, I can imitate Jimmy Stewart. That means I can write speeches and you could too. Some people can do it. It's really a question of being able to hear somebody else's voice in your head while you write. And it turned out I had a knack for it. I could do it.
And what a great voice you had to hear when you moved over to the President's team.
The President's team, exactly.
Presidents speak a lot, some incessantly. And particularly since the radio and television age, and now in the internet age,
yes.
I mean, you can't escape the words that are pouring from their mouths. And yet, these millions of words, it's amazing how few have endured. I mean, you know, John Kennedy, think not what your country can do for you, et cetera. A date that will live in infamy, the Gettysburg Address. I mean, your speech, that line has joined that pantheon. That's pretty cool stuff.
It is cool stuff, and I have a child of mine right here. Are you listening to this? A little respect, please.
It's become, this is not the time to air your dirty laundry.
I'm all right.
It's become part of the popular culture. Monday Night Football, which has been on forever, has a little opening montage where they show historical moments over the time they've been on the air and things that define the era, and something familiar is a part of that. And here's a clip. Talk about the popular culture. You
Fights the football.
Tear down this wall.
And nobody catches ball. Monday night.
There you go. There you go. It's Howard Cosell, it's Dandy Don, and it's Peter. That's it, together again. Some people in the public eye, when they get associated with something closely, whether it's a role, a remark, an incident, another person, sometimes it begins to grate on them. They don't want to talk about it. They roll their eyes. Do I have to talk about that again? You know, I've done other things. You appear to have embraced this and understand the historical significance. Did you ever have a time when you said, "Oh, I don't want to talk about that again"?
The answer is slightly complicated, but I'll try not to go on and on. In the old days being the days when I was a speechwriter, the rule was that the speechwriters were anonymous. And by the way, I hope we get a chance to get to this, but if you ask me, that speech, thank you for, I am associated with it, but the speech was Ronald Reagan. It was Ronald Reagan from beginning to end, and if we get a chance to discuss how it came to be, you'll see that only he would have delivered it. In any event, for the first 10 years, I didn't say a peep about it. I didn't associate myself with it in any way. And then I discovered that one of the diplomats who in fact had tried to stop it was in Germany, where he'd been nominated to a high position in Germany, and a friend of mine in Germany sent me I had to have it translated. This guy was taking credit for it. And I thought, that's not right. That's just not right. It was Ronald Reagan, and we speechwriters it was our job. It was not an apparatchik at the State Department. So I wrote a piece about it then, and it turns out that it's all right. It's easy to live with because people only become interested in it about once every 5 years. And I have the feeling that on this, the 30th anniversary, you and I'm discussing it now for the last time. I don't think anybody will be all that interested 35 years from now.
Well, it's interesting.
And who knows, my memory may go.
It's interesting to talk about timelines because it seems strange, but we're now into the second generation of people to whom the Cold War, the Wall, the Soviet Union are notes in their history books.
So this year, being the 30th anniversary, 3 or 4 times I've talked about the speech. And 3 or 4 times, you wouldn't do this because you're a professional. But if I have a laugh line that works, I'll just use it over and over again because good laugh lines are hard to come by. So I learned a long time ago that if I begin speaking by saying I had a special job, I was the well man in the speechwriting shop, speech would get written, go to the president, come back, and then it would come to me, the well man, and I would go through and I would insert here and there, well. So with this audience, it worked. And then I spoke to some kids at Dartmouth College, my alma mater, and I said, well, nothing. And then I had to back way up and figure out, do you know who Ronald Reagan was? It was kind of fun. It took me 10 minutes. And all right. So, but it's gone. It's gone.
So the wall itself, just to put it a little historical context here, it was a physical barrier, but it was much more than that. I mean, it was really representative of a generation, really. Talk about that.
All right. The end of World War II, Germany is divided into 2 pieces. The Soviets control the eastern part, which quickly becomes Eastern Germany, and the Americans, British, and French control the rest, which quickly becomes West Germany. And then Berlin itself is divided into 2 parts. The Soviets control one bit, and we control the other. But, and this is the bit that kids these days don't know, Berlin lies deep inside East Germany. So even West Berlin is completely surrounded by East Germany. And what happened is that after the war, as West Germany began to rebuild, and it became clear that East Germany was going to become communist, millions of people, literally millions, escaped East Germany simply by walking into West Berlin. And once they were in West Berlin, they could get on a train and go to West Germany, and they were free. And by 1961, 1/5 of the population of East Germany had done just that. They were bleeding population. And so overnight, one night, you woke up one morning in West Berlin, and West Berlin was completely surrounded by barbed wire. And in the course of days and weeks, they replaced the barbed wire with brick. And then by the mid-70s, they replaced the brick with tall concrete slabs. And so what you had in the Berlin Wall was this little pocket of the West, West Berlin, literally surrounded by a 13-foot wall in the middle of the communist world.
And unlike some of the walls we're talking about now, wasn't to keep people out, it was to keep people in.
It was to keep people in East Germany.
Yeah.
That is exactly correct. That is exactly correct. And when I went there to do research for this, one of the most striking things, in fact, the wall is gone, but there are still, if you know what you're looking for, there are still memorials to people who were killed trying to escape over the wall. So that's the background, that it was as brutal a reminder of what the bad guys were up to as you could possibly imagine. They created such a bad society that their own people were desperate to get out, and they had to wall them in.
You mentioned going there for research.
Yes.
Is the story true about a lady who may have sparked the well-known line to you?
It is true indeed. It is true indeed. I was there for research. I was only there for about a day and a half, and I went around to various sites in Berlin, beginning with where the president would speak. And then that evening, I broke away from the American Party, that is to say the advance men, the press people, and the security and so forth, and got into a cab and went out to a suburban home in West Berlin, where the Eltzes, Dieter Eltz and Ingeborg Eltz, whom I had never met before, but we had friends in common in Washington, put on a dinner party for me of West Berliners, simply so I could get to know some West Berliners. And we chat a little bit, and then I said, I have to tell you that the ranking American diplomat in Berlin earlier today told me, President Reagan's speechwriter, don't make a big deal out of the wall. They've gotten used to it by now. And I had been flown over the wall in a U.S. Army helicopter. So I said, it looks to me as though it would be the kind of thing that would be hard to get used to. Is it true? Have you gotten used to it? And there was a silence. And then one man raised his arm and pointed. And he said, my sister lives just a few kilometers in that direction, but I haven't seen her in more than 20 years. You think we can get used to that? So they had stopped talking about it, but they hadn't gotten used to it. We went around the room. Another fellow said, I walk to work by the same route each day. I pass under a guard tower, and there's a young man on that tower with a rifle over his shoulder who looks down at me with binoculars. We share the same history. We speak the same language, but one of us is a zookeeper and the other is an animal. And I've never been able to decide which was which. And then our hostess, a lovely woman called Ingeborg Eltz, who just died a couple of years ago. And she was a lovely woman. She was a gracious hostess, but she became angry. And she said, if this man Gorbachev means this talk, this perestroika, this glasnost, he can prove it by coming here and getting rid of that wall. And that was, now by this point I'd been in the White House for 5 years. I knew Ronald Reagan. I don't mean to say that I played cards with Ronald Reagan or that I was a guest at the ranch, nothing of that kind. The relationship was entirely professional, but we speechwriters, it was our job to know the mind of the president, to watch which material he liked, to understand how he thought. And I just knew the moment she said that if Ronald Reagan had been there, he would have responded to that. The simplicity, but the power of that remark. And so I put it into my notebook and went back to the White House, and that did become the basis for tear down this wall.
So it's decided the president's going to speak.
Yes.
Brandenburg Gate. He's got to say something. And the wheels are set in motion.
Yes.
Take us through the process.
Process is that Robinson gets these. By the way, there would be about half a dozen speeches each year that we knew were going to be big-ish speeches. And then there's also a lot of remarks in the Rose Garden and so forth. And we tried to share those out relatively evenly. So it was just my turn for a big speech. So that's why I got the assignment.
Wait, is it literally that was?
Yeah, no, it was just about.
You were next in line.
I was next in line. That's right. And the White House staff guidance was, he's going to stand in front of. Here's where he's standing, and we'll have about 10,000 people in front of him. Turned out to be about 40,000. Talk for half an hour. Probably got to talk about foreign policy, given the site. That was it. The rest was up to me to figure out, to do the first draft thinking, so to speak, as well as the first draft writing. So the process was I flew to Berlin. I spent a day and a half getting research. It was a very moving day and a half, partly because it was so frightening to me. I went to the site where the president would speak, and I don't know, this is a problem I don't know how to convey to kids of my own son's generation what it felt like to stand at the Berlin Wall. And here's the Reichstag, which is still pockmarked from shelling during the Second World War. And behind you, you have a modern city. People are well dressed. There are neon lights. They're driving beautiful Mercedes-Benz. It's a modern city. There's life. And you look over on the other side, and you see guards walking back and forth, a few pedestrians, dilapidated buildings. This is in color, and this is just in black and white. And the felt sense of history there's really something close to evil, and here we have freedom. Now, all I have to do is write a speech for Ronald Reagan that lives up to that sense of moment, that sense of place. And then I went and saw the ranking American diplomat who was full of ideas about what the president shouldn't say. And then I went to this dinner party. So I was taking notes madly all day long. Back I went to the White House. I wrote a couple of really bad drafts. In one draft, I thought, audience is going to be German, so the key line was, Herr Gorbachev, machen Sie dieser Tor auf. And my boss, Tony Dolan, said, Peter, when your client is the President of the United States, give him his best lines in English. Yeah. All right. So Tony Dolan, chief speechwriter at the time, plays a central role here. The president was also going to Italy to talk at the Venice Economic Summit. He'd visit Rome, he'd see the Pope, he'd see the President of Italy, there'd be speeches involved in the Venice Economic Summit, and then he'd go to Berlin. So Tony had the whole speechwriting shop produce all of this stuff at once. And then he waited until a Friday afternoon in May, until you could hear the sound of the helicopter landing on the South Lawn to take the president to Camp David. I'm not making this up. And Tony took this sheaf of speeches over to the West Wing and said to the staff secretary, who was new, ordinarily these things would go out to staffing before they went to the president, but look how much, you'd better send him this to Camp David this weekend so he can get a little ahead with this workload. And the staff secretary did. So the president saw the draft before the staff saw it. Then the following Monday, we had a meeting in the Oval Office with the president. Very eerie experience to go into the mock-up Oval Office here because it is exactly right in every detail. In any event, talk about this speech, that speech, and then we got to my speech. And the president just said, well, that was a good draft. That's a fine speech. And then I said, we'd go in with questions. You might have time for one question, maybe two. You'd go in with questions that you would hope would elicit more from Ronald Reagan. So I said, I learned when I was in Berlin that depending on weather conditions, people will be able to hear your speech on the other side, the communist side, maybe even as far east as Moscow. Mr. President, is there anything in particular you want to say to the people on the communist side of the wall? And Ronald Reagan thought for a moment, and then he said, well, there's that passage about tearing down the wall. That's what I want to say to them. That wall has to come down. And that was all. But then the speech went out to staffing. And for 3 weeks, the National Security Council, the State Department, everybody fought it. But they couldn't get over it.
Well,
yes, go ahead.
I want to show, may we show see how the system works. Here's a draft of the speech with a few marks on it. Now, I want to, and I want to highlight one, maybe on another page, but it's a note written apparently in a later draft
Yes.
by Colin Powell. And I'm sure you're familiar with this.
Oh, yes.
Here was his summation. The Brandenburg Gate speech is better than before, but the staff is still unanimous that it's a mediocre speech and a missed opportunity. Where do you go from there?
To think what might have been.
So was there near unanimity on that line, particularly that
Yes.
it needed to go?
Yes.
Who
Yes.
was in your corner on that?
Ronald Reagan.
That's it.
Full stop. Well, with
If you
the
have to have
speechwriters.
someone in your corner, that's
The speech, it turned out to be the correct, yes, the full stop, the speechwriters. So the way this goes, the essential point is, if the State Department and NSC had gotten me to change my mind, because I was the speechwriter who'd gone and done the research. If I'd written a cover memo, Dear Mr. President, on second thoughts, I got part of this wrong, and I recommend that we rewrite the speech as follows, there's a strong chance he would have deferred to the writer who had done the research. Ronald Reagan was never personally close to almost anybody, but you know, he liked his writers. And your other chance was Ronald Reagan himself. But the president, this is why that meeting in the Oval Office was so important, because the president had already said he'd particularly like to deliver that passage. And that meant their only recourse was me. So I got yanked into meeting after meeting after meeting, and I just was stubborn about it.
So your argument was, hey, the chief likes this.
My argument was, first of all, Ronald Reagan likes it, and frankly, the other argument was, they submitted different drafts, alternative drafts, and they were bureaucratic. You can't put Ronald Reagan in front of the Berlin Wall and have him read bureaucratic dreck. And by the way, so the decision, they went to Italy. Now this I don't have this firsthand because I was not part of the traveling party, but they went to Italy, and the deputy chief of staff, a man called Ken Duberstein, the fight is going on and on and on. And Ken Duberstein said, we have to take this back to the president. So Ken Duberstein told me what happened. He sat Ronald Reagan down in the garden of some Italian palazzo. He explained the arguments against this passage. It would put Gorbachev in a tight spot. It was unrealistic. It would raise false hopes, and so forth. And then he had the president reread it. And then Ken said they talked about it for a moment. And then the twinkle came on. And the president said, now, I'm the president, aren't I? Yes, sir, we're clear about that much. So I get to decide if that line stays in? Yes, sir, it is your decision. Well, then, it stays in.
Wow. Wow. If you don't mind my sharing a little personal email that you sent to me, you talked about how you revisit the speech every few years because people don't talk about it for a while. And I assume you hadn't read the full speech in a good while.
I haven't read it in years.
Well, Peter read it recently, and he said to me, well, I want to get it right. He said, you know, I had an occasion to reread the speech. It's pretty good. You know what else was interesting about the speech to me is there was a lot in it that was political. I mean, Ronald Reagan was not shy about making the point that the Soviet Union was crumbling in large measure because of his policies, confronting the missile defense, brouhaha, he said, basically he said to all of you who've been demonstrating against this, it was that policy that is making this all happen. So there was certainly a political element.
It is, we think of
domestic political.
Exactly so, yes, for sure. We tend to remember Ronald Reagan correctly as the most genial, the warmest, the loveliest of men. What we sometimes forget is how aggressive he was. And so here we have, this is June of 1987, Gorbachev is in power, they've had the summit in Reykjavik, and the State Department argument is, wait a minute, everything's coming our way. Lay off the guy. And Ronald Reagan said, no, no, no. The Berlin Wall is still there. That system is still evil. I'm pressing my advantage. You're serious about perestroika? Tear down this wall. There's only one way out of this for you. That was Ronald Reagan. He wasn't going to go all sweet. on the Soviets.
Another thing that struck me in reading it is there's some other wonderful passages that people have forgotten about it. And I've asked you about some of your favorites, and I know there's one, I guess, near the end of the speech.
That's right.
And I think it might be good to look at what the president says, because it's a beautiful passage, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the circumstances around it, because that's an interesting story too. So this is near the end of the Brandenburg.
The totalitarian world finds even symbols of love and of worship an affront. Years ago, before the East Germans began rebuilding their churches, they erected a secular structure, the television tower at Alexanderplatz. Virtually ever since, the authorities have been working to correct what they view as the tower's one major flaw: treating the glass sphere at the top with paints and chemicals of every kind. Yet even today, when the sun strikes that sphere that towers over all Berlin, the light makes the sign of the cross. There in Berlin, like the city itself, symbols of love, symbols of worship cannot be suppressed. The totalitarian world finds
Something happened
Yes.
during that speech was fascinating.
Again, this almost sounds like Disney. It almost sounds too much, but it happened. It was a gray, overcast day, and again, I wasn't there, but I could see it on television, and the people who were there came back, and actually I got a phone call from Tony Dolan while they were still there. So it was a gray, overcast day, and there's this ball, this tower in East Berlin.
The one he referred
The
to.
one he's referring to. And he's talking about the sun coming out and so forth. And you couldn't see it because there was no sign of the cross. It was just this gray ball in a gray sky. And then he got to the passage, and the clouds opened up. And the sun came out, and the sign of the cross appeared on that thing. And so my conclusion there is that God probably could do all right at Disney.
You know, seeing the clip, there's something emotional about it to me, and he was such an extraordinary.
I listen to this, once every 5 years. I listen to it a few times, but I know you don't want me doing any of the asking of questions here. But just as a pure performer, just as a guy who could connect.
Oh yeah.
He was one of the greats.
Yeah,
wasn't he?
on a real visceral kind of level. I mean, but I wonder about this. If sometimes I think that the Republican Party in general, and specifically the conservative movement, have not wounded themselves in a strange way, searching for the next Reagan. When you look at that clip, you see what an extraordinarily unique individual he was. And, when you start saying, we got to have another Reagan, then you're dissatisfied with everything that comes along. There is no other Reagan. I mean, would you agree with that? It hasn't helped the party. It hasn't helped the conservative movement it's great to have that to build on, but you can't replicate that.
You can't replicate it. I got a little lesson of this. This will sound, well, I was about to say it sound self-referential. It is self-referential. But the person.
But if you acknowledge it, it's fine.
It's just, why, thank you, Pat. So, when this little program, Uncommon Knowledge, and now it's a big program now that you're hosting it.
Of course.
But when Uncommon Knowledge.
We've taken it to the next level.
We started with just a couple of stations up north near Stanford, a couple of PBS stations. And when Bill Buckley took his show, Firing Line, off the air at the end of 1999, he called me and said, Peter, I'm going to recommend you to the PBS system as my replacement. And my response was immediate. I said, Bill, I can't be you. And Bill got cross. Bill became cross. And he said, don't you ever attempt to be me. Just be you and do that as well as you can. And it's that kind of thing. We get these large figures. Bill Buckley still is a hero. Milton Friedman, Ronald Reagan, those are sort of the three heroes of my young manhood. And all three of them would say, stop it. You have to be who yourselves.
Yeah. You can always tell when Bill Buckley was angry because he would speak monosyllabically. This is an unfair question because it calls for, if you're trying to get in someone else's shoes and someone else's head for that matter, but just it might be fun to speculate. What do you think Ronald Reagan would make of Donald Trump? Seriously. As a man,
Sure.
as a politician,
So, okay,
as a
so
president?
there are, well, the immediate response is there's a lot about Donald Trump that Ronald Reagan would find pretty hard to take. And the comments about, Ronald Reagan was a Midwestern gentleman. I add Midwestern because there's a kind of sense of solidness about his character, simplicity about his character. And Donald Trump is a loudmouth from Queens. And so,
I believe
okay,
that was his slogan in
That's
the
right.
race.
and so you have to correct for the difference in background, but even for correcting for that, the tape about Donald Trump's, what he said about women, it may have been 10 years old. Such words would never have formed themselves in Ronald Reagan's mind.
So on that level, he
on
certainly
that
would have been
level, for
appalled.
sure.
Politically.
But politically, I have to say that, and I think that Reagan would have appreciated certain of Trump's impulses or his instincts. Now, Reagan could actually think things through. He was always writing, he was always thinking, and Donald Trump, as best I can tell, isn't a reader or a writer, either one particularly.
Although
this,
arithmetic, he's very good.
arithmetic, he knows ratings, he follows ratings. But the fundamental impulse that somehow or other the country needs to be made great again, that you need defense spending, you need tax cuts, these fundamental impulses I think the President Reagan would have approved of, but he would have liked to have slapped Donald Trump himself a few times, I think.
Let's talk about this show, which began on PBS in the 90s,
2000, well, actually 90s, 98, I think, with 2 stations.
and grew and ran for several years on PBS.
And correct, and now it's just a vidcast. It turns out when we took the show off PBS, our audience dropped dramatically, but the responses went way up. So you're actually finding people my feeling is that on the internet, the show finds people who are actually interested in
Sure.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, not just waiting for Elmo.
Not just waiting for them.
So taken as a whole, how has this experience affected you? I mean, you've talked to politicians, you've talked to philosophers, you've talked to scientists. Has it changed your worldview in meeting all these people and hearing what they have to say? I mean, do you feel better about this? Has it changed your attitudes about this country, about yourself?
Sure. Well, I mean, one thing it's taught me is certain humility. There are a lot of people on this world who know more than I do. Not you necessarily, but
you saved me the trouble.
I could see it coming. I could see. It's been a kind of graduate seminar in America. The number of people even people I disagree with, people care about the United States of America in a way that I'm not sure is quite parallel with the way Germans care about Germany. There's something about this experiment that people from Tom Wolfe, who's a literary figure, of course, but if you ask him what's your deepest love, he'll answer America. Or Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens, who was wrong about almost everything. It was just amazing how wrong Christopher was.
What a fascinating guy.
Christopher cared about the United States of America. The argument was taking place right here. So I suppose that talking to all of these people, no matter who the guest is and no matter what the subject, in one way or another, the text is the United States.
Who's surprised you as a guest? In a bad way, in a good way? They were smarter than you thought? They were different than you thought? They threw you for a loop in one way or another?
Milton Friedman, there was one exchange I had with Milton Friedman that stayed with me ever since, the late Milton Friedman. And I can't even remember the argument, it was some economic argument, and I stopped him and I said, well, wait, Milton, what you just said doesn't sound like a technical economic argument, that sounds like a moral argument. You're arguing about what's right and what's wrong. And Milton Friedman, the greatest economist of the 20th century, just looked at me and said, Peter, of course it's a moral argument. What other kind of argument is there? Ah, that's very deep. The ground of all argument is what's right. What's wrong, but what's right. That was tremendous.
You must have had, among the many shows, and I've seen so many of them, they're virtually all of them brilliant. But,
Virtually?
what is that? Was you doing Jack Benny?
I was. I had to get it in once on the show with you. You do yours. Shall we do it together? 3,
Dennis.
2, 1. Rochester.
But there must have been a time or two when, there's a little clock you have up here that tells you how much time has gone, and you must be thinking, well, it's been about a half hour, and you look and you've been on for 4 minutes because it's been excruciating. I won't ask for any names, but do you have any trick to get through those?
I do more talking myself.
Yeah.
To get through those. I did there.
If you want to mention a name.
I will mention we've had very successful shows since, but one of the very first, I think it was the second show that I taped, was with George Shultz, former Secretary of State.
Okay.
And I asked him a question that he didn't want to answer. It was television. And there was a big, long wind-up. And it was when the war in the Balkans was taking place, and I made this historical parallel about the Reconquista in Spain, where the Christian kingdoms took 7 centuries to drive back the Muslims. And isn't there an argument? They would make it themselves. The Serbians argue that they're simply trying to recapture their own country in just the same way as the Spanish recaptured Spain. And Mr. Secretary, what do you make of that argument? And here was George Shultz's answer in full. This taught me how a great diplomat operates.
Yeah.
On to the next question.
in a big hurry. Speaking of people who don't want to answer questions, politicians are often known for that. And they go to their talking points. They answer the question sometime that they want to answer rather than the one you asked. Have you learned to finesse your way around that to get to the crux of the matter when someone doesn't want you to get there?
I don't know that I've learned it. I mean, it's a permanent frustration. But my judgment is that if I ask a question a second time and they still won't answer it, it's not up to me to reach across and grab their tie and pull them in and slap them, which is the treatment they get on certain networks and certain talk shows. But my judgment is that my audience, which is smaller, and they're people who find their way to the show themselves, my audience knows what just happened. And I don't have to point it out. And these guys, by the way, one thing that has changed in my thinking, when I interview politicians, governors, senators, these are all impressive people. And getting elected, we forget this. So, the Congress, what idiots they all are. You know what? I have yet to discover an idiot in Congress. Getting elected is hard work. These guys are, by and large, very impressive, and surprisingly enough, at least it surprised me, maybe because I was so naive, every single one of them that I've encountered is in one way or another a real believer. These guys, I'm thinking of Mitch McConnell. I did an interview with Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell, the take on Mitch McConnell would be that he's a technician, he's a master of the rules of the Senate, and all he cares about is power. You ask Mitch McConnell a couple of questions about what he would do if he had more votes, if he had more power, if he weren't calculating on the margin so closely all the time. And every single answer is very conservative. Mitch McConnell is a conservative in any event. So my judgment is to let these guys, if they don't want to answer a question, make that clear to the audience that they're evading a question and then move on. Yeah. Maybe that's too sweet, I don't know. Too easy.
No, you're not the tie grabber type. It's all right. Maybe we talk about your family a little bit?
You may.
You have, by today's standards, a rather large one.
Yes, it's a large Catholic family from the 1950s as corrected for inflation.
Numerically?
5.
It's 3 boys and 2 girls?
3 boys and 2 girls.
Okay.
Yes.
And your wife?
Only one wife.
Yes.
Yes.
Adita.
Edita. Edita. Her parents left Cuba in 1959, and she was born about 18 months later. She has 3 older brothers, all of whom were born in Havana. My father-in-law is the only man I know of who served in the administrations of both Fidel Castro and Ronald Reagan.
Wow.
He was given no choice but to serve for Fidel, and it took him 3 months to figure out how to get out of the country.
As a father of 2, I understand fatherly pride, and one of Peter's sons,
Your
Nico,
2 are so good that really you don't need any more. We had to keep at it.
That's why we stopped. Dad and my wife said, we're stopping. No, I just said that to get a cheap laugh. Where was I going with this? I have no idea. Now, Nico. So, a track and field guy, and particularly pole vaulting.
Yes.
And I understand fatherly pride. I can't tell you how many pole vaulting videos I've received from Peter Robinson. He's a very impressive pole vaulter.
Would it kill you to say like father, like son?
Have you ever pole vaulted?
No. But I never get any. They all say, "Oh, yes, must get it all from his mother." Yeah.
So as you look ahead here, now you continue to
Look
write.
ahead.
You continue.
What kind of show is this?
You continue to write.
I do.
Yes. Do you have another book in you?
You know, I had a book in me. The answer is I hope so, but I'm not working on a book right now. I worked for years on a book on the beginnings of the Cold War, and I couldn't quite get it done. History, it turns out, I'll give you an example. Just yesterday or the day before, there appeared in the Wall Street Journal a column on how Trump should learn from the way Harry Truman handled the beginnings of the Cold War. Trump should understand that Harry Truman ginned up public indignation and addressed the populist impulse in the country. And this column quoted Senator Vandenberg. You see, you're already falling asleep. This is exactly what this is. It's quoted Senator Vandenberg as telling Harry Truman that if you're going to have to give a speech in which you scare the hell out of the American people. I spent a week of my life trying to track down the citation for that quotation. This is years ago. And it turns out, as best I can tell, that Senator Vandenberg never said any such thing. That quotation doesn't pop up until about 3 years later. But it took me a week of my life to find out something that wasn't actually there. Oh. And that's what writing history is like. So I'm saving that. I intend to live to about the age of 120, and I'll take up this book again at 118.
Why don't you write a fake history book? Just a thought. I don't know. When you come here to the library and museum, it is a great place.
It is.
But you must have all kinds of emotions that run through you when you walk into the Oval Office, which is, as you said earlier, is perfect in terms of how it's laid out here. What goes through Peter Robinson's head?
Here I am with the most cheerful and lighthearted of men, and this is a kind of for me it's a little bit of it's kind of disconcerting or disorienting. For me, it's rather sad. Because when I walk into this Oval Office replica, which is exact in every way, my friends aren't there, and Ronald Reagan isn't there, and that's at some level that's just it's disappointing to me. It's like going back to your college campus and saying, wait a minute, where is everybody? That was decades ago. So that. I won't say that I knew Ronald Reagan well. I mean, I did know him very well in some sense. I understood his mind, I think. I didn't play, as I said, I didn't play hearts with him up at the ranch. But I knew him. He was a big part. I'll tell you, okay, so this is a little bit off, but it'll get to the point. It'll help you understand what I feel, I think.
I'll get a roadmap.
Okay, go ahead. Please do it. Feel free to take notes. Bill Safire started a club for presidential speechwriters. Bill Safire, the late columnist for the New York Times, who was a speechwriter for Richard Nixon. And for a number of years, we'd get together. Jack Valenti hosted us at the Motion Picture Association. He had a big dining room in Washington, and we'd get together there. And there were 2 tables of writers whose politics were very different, but who understood each other just instinctively. And that was the Kennedy table and the Reagan table. And that was because we both just loved our presidents. John Kennedy was the biggest thing that had ever happened to Ted Sorensen. And Ronald Reagan was a pretty big thing in our lives as well. And so I don't like to say this because it sounds sappy and because it's not useful. It's not useful. It's a little too close to this notion of searching for another Ronald Reagan. But I miss him.
Yeah.
I miss him.
I think we all do. You know, you're a terrific host, but you're also a terrific guest, Peter Robinson. Thank you very much for doing this. We thank you for letting me turn the tables. You can switch chairs next week if you'd like.
I will.
Is there anything you'd like to add as you end this your first guest shot on your own show?
I'm dazzled by Patrick Sajak.
He's good.
How many people have Americans invited into their homes for year after year after year? Johnny Carson, it's single digits. We are in the presence of one of the greatest broadcasters and entertainers in the country's history. Wow. Thank you, Pat.
Wow. Well, thank you. Now, if I were really a true great broadcaster, I would have ended it on "I miss Ronald Reagan," but I wanted to go on so he'd say something nice about me. Thank you, Peter. It was great. And a privilege to sit in your chair. Thank you so much. And our thanks again to all the good folks here at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library and Museum for their hospitality. And again, it's a wonderful place. You really should come. It's worth a trip to California. So, for Peter Robinson, for Uncommon Knowledge and the Hoover Institution, I'm Pat Sajak. Nice job, sir.
Thank you.
Now that we've done the rehearsal, we're going to roll tape. We're going to ask, we have a few minutes. If anyone here has a question, we'd be happy to take it to Peter, to me, to anyone. There's a gentleman right there. Let the lady come over with a microphone. Go ahead.
I was wondering about the poignancy of your speech. I was thinking about what maybe makes it a little bit different from some of the other speeches. I was thinking, first of all, you addressed Mr. Gorbachev by name and directly. You also, in a sense, gave him a directive, an imperative sentence in a sense. Tear down this wall. You were telling him what to do. If you contrast that with Kennedy's speech, for example, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. He's making a request, you're making more of a directive. I was wondering if you can talk about why you think your speech in particular was so poignant and so it resonated so much with everybody.
The obvious point, but I have to do this. It was Ronald Reagan's speech, really and truly it was Ronald Reagan's speech. I wouldn't have written it for anybody else, and nobody else would have overruled all the objections to deliver it. But the direct challenge to Gorbachev, mentioning him by name, is exactly what drove the State Department crazy. So you're exactly right to identify that. In my 1982, Reagan speaks to the Houses of Parliament, and he lays it all out. The Soviet Union it still can't feed itself. That's the economic case. 1983, he gives the evil empire address. He makes the moral case. And by 1987, Gorbachev is in power. He's trying out glasnost and perestroika. And again, what's striking to me is that Ronald Reagan, I felt instinctively, and the president agreed enough to go ahead and deliver the speech, that you stand in front of that wall, and it's so outrageous. It is so outrageous that there's no choice. You can't be mealy-mouthed about it. One of the State Department alternative drafts came in and said, one day this wall will fall. One day? What do you mean it will fall? It'll just collapse of its own? What the hell is that all about?
Mistakes were made.
Yes, exactly.
The wall will fall.
Exactly. So it fits, the reason I mentioned those other couple of speeches is it fits in a context of Ronald Reagan, who wanted to destroy the Soviet Union. Sweet man, but don't cross him. And the Soviets offended him.
Anybody else have a question? Sir?
First of all, I just want to thank you guys for doing this. This is just awesome. Reagan is one of my heroes. One of the things I couldn't understand was why so many in the press thought that Reagan was stupid. And can you talk about like what it was like to have discussions with him and why, you know, like I was really struck when I read the book Reagan in His Own Hand, talking about his speeches and things that he hand wrote. What was it like interacting with him around the speeches and you know, just speak about that generally.
So here I draw a comparison, if I may, between Ronald Reagan and Pat Sajak. Now, Pat will tell you, his line is, all I do is play hangman on television, and he's charming and he's affable. You get to know Pat Sajak, and he's very well read, and he sits on important boards. And my friend Wendy Borchert, I think, was going to try to be here. Wendy Borchert, who's an important figure in Southern California, has told me that in very quiet ways, Pat has participated in important causes here in Southern California again and again and again. Ronald Reagan had a certain persona in show business. It was genuine to him. He wasn't putting anything on. But he also didn't mind permitting people to think that was all that there was. But it wasn't all that there was. Marlin Fitzwater, press secretary, told me once they were flying someplace to Europe. Marlin had to brief the president on something, and he noticed that the president in Air Force One, the president was reading a book, and he had a stack of books that he brought with him. And there was a novel and a work of history, 2 or 3 books. And Marlin said, Mr. President, by the way, do you mind if I brief the press on the books you've brought with you? And Marlin told me, he said, you know, the president said, oh, it's all right, it's up to you if you want to. But it was clear Ronald Reagan really didn't want the press to know that he was reading books. So what it was like to interact with him is that he was himself, he was charming, he was self-deprecating, he was warm, but there was a mind there. He knew a lot about a lot, and he was a very good editor. He could write. So just take a look at Pat, and that'll explain a lot.
We have time for just one more question if anyone has one, and I'm going to go to the back of the room if I may, right there.
Peter, I am a docent volunteer at the Reagan Library.
Congratulations, and thank you.
Thank you. 11th year now.
Great.
And of course, we get children from various grades coming here. And every time I stand in front of the replica Berlin Wall or outside to the piece of the Berlin Wall, I think to myself, rather than rattling off 10 feet tall, 350 guard towers, what is it that you would say to these children so you could communicate the importance and the passion behind the wall?
Wow, that sounds like a hard speech assignment, actually. That's the kind of thing where I'd have to go away and produce a bad first draft in 1 week. And
I'll call Colin Powell and see what he thinks.
Well, exactly. It's a very good question, but it bothers me even now. I don't think I could have conveyed to my own children what it was like to be in Berlin. Even, frankly, I talked to Berliners, the new generation of Berliners, and they can't quite get what it was like to be in West Berlin. You could forget about the wall for a moment, and then you'd turn a corner and look down a street, and at the end, it's walled off. I don't know what you would say to children except imagine being in jail. Imagine being in jail. I don't know what else you could say. Pat, I flubbed it. We can't end on a bad answer.
It's okay, but we'll take another question just so you end on a higher note. Did someone had one in here, and I didn't want to shortchange you. Yes, sir.
If those words, tear down that wall, had been left out of that speech, how do you think history would be different?
Oh,
That's a good question.
what a good question.
Yeah. Why don't you come up here? Wish I'd thought of it.
It's in there. I know it's in there. Repeat the question. The question is, if the phrase, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, had not been in the speech, how might history have been different? And the answer is, of course, we'll never know. History doesn't let us run controlled experiments, but I've spent a long time, all these years now, wondering about just that. What effect did the speech have? Did it make any difference at all? And the only effect I was aware of at the time was that a couple days later, I was in the White House mess, and somebody came in and sat down at the luncheon table next to me. It was a fellow called Peter Rodman who wrote that memo to Colin Powell. So I stiffened because he'd fought the speech and fought the speech and fought the speech. And he sat down and turned to me and said, well, Peter, it looks as though our speech was a big success. But he said that our intelligence services had picked up cable traffic between Moscow and East Germany, telling the East Germans, you've got to loosen up restrictions on the wall. You have to permit more checkpoints and so forth. And then years went by, and who knows what, 18 months later, the wall came down. And only in more recent years, I've spoken to people who were in East Berlin or East Germany. And they all have said to me the same thing, that when Ronald Reagan said, tear down this wall, it wasn't thrilling exactly, it was just unbelievable that the wall was fixed. It had become a permanent part of their life. And I feel Václav Havel, the Czech dissident who became president of the Czech Republic after the fall of communism, used to talk about creating spaces for thought and feeling. And really, that was what Pope John Paul II was doing. It was what Margaret Thatcher was doing. And I have concluded that when the President of the United States said, tear down this wall, people in East Berlin and East Germany could think thoughts that they hadn't thought the day before. That's my conclusion.
Scott, are you here? You want to say something? You need to say something to folks? You've been like the perfect audience, haven't they? I mean, see, the problem with audiences, and I trace this back to Arsenio Hall, when the audience started barking. The audiences now want to become part of the show. They want to bark. They want to be the last person heard. Instead, you sat there, you responded, you seemed interested, or you faked it if you weren't. And we greatly appreciate it, and we thank you very much for coming. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat.